What I'm going to be talking about is the tech debt that we've acquired over the years and how to get rid of it, whether it be through deprecation or whether it be through forcing it to a modern platform. Let's see if my clicker works. My clicker is going no. Technology issues. What do you know? Okay, so we can do this instead. So the retirement phase of the development life cycle is frequently neglected and significantly has greater costs than just leaving a couple extra systems online. I will share some of our experiences with technical debt in both hardware and software and the real costs around it. So how do you decide when it's time for something to go? Or what do you use the appeal of modernization to make it go? So why is this personal? You have right here a picture of my garbage disposal. I don't know how many of you do your own home improvement, but as I did this piece of work where I was replacing my garbage disposal, I went, this is the perfect analogy for what I deal with on a day-to-day basis in technology. This thing is sitting there for 20 years. It has calcified on so hard, reading the instructions on how to remove it, it says turn this thing. Well, this thing no longer turns. A can of WD-40 later, somebody stronger than me later, and we finally have it removed because the parts that it said should move didn't move. Sorry for the feedback. It took so long to get this thing off, and like I said, I felt like it was an analogy for how we treat our tech debt every day. 20 years of life as a garbage disposal, yeah, it's a very clear analogy right there. So why is this personal? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and why I care so much about it, who we are, who Ticketmaster is, and why Ticketmaster has so much of this to care about. Some of the challenges we're up against in trying to clear out our tech debt problems, and how do we start to fix it? And finally, a little bit of why. So let me introduce myself. I am Heather Osborn, Dark Queen of Ticketing. I picked up this name a really long time ago. A couple of my old colleagues are laughing because they remember when I got this name. I know where the bodies are buried. That's also why I'm the Dark Queen of Ticketing. So I've been at Ticketmaster for coming on 22 years. April 1st is my anniversary. April Fool's Day, my longest running April Fool's joke ever. I've ended up staying with Ticketmaster after years of doing the startup shuffle. After a year, I would get bored and move on. After another year, another company, I'd get bored and move on. The appeal of throwing plastic balls at each other didn't keep me interested. The appeal of coming to a very large-scale infrastructure with new challenges, interesting challenges, that kept me interested. I stuck around for a really long time. We joke that you're either at Ticketmaster for life. Why does it sound like there's a telex back there? Okay, I'm going to stand still now. You joke that at Ticketmaster, you're either there for a year or you're there for life, and I'm working on the life side of it, and I am by no means the longest tenured person at the company. Myself personally, I came into technology sideways. I was a journalism major. I wanted to write about things. I found that I was good at fixing people's printers. I was good at fixing their computer. I was good at explaining why things were happening, getting things on the network. So it stuck. I sat in my car reading Unix books. I was going to say Linux, but back then it was Unix System 5 Release 4. I was reading the textbooks. I was reading the networking manuals and trying to figure out how to make things work together until I eventually got a tech job. And then the last thing here, I've been effectively on call for 25 years. When you've been on call for 25 years, admittedly I'm on call for management now, it's still you're on call. If somebody's calling you for something, it means that something big is happening. You're not just doing the, oops, that box fell over, let's fix that box. I want to make sure that everything is resilient. I want to make sure that everything has more automation. If there's something, a problem, you just click a button and make it go better. And I want to make sure I get fewer calls. My social things that I do are not conducive to being on call. I'm a live music and nightclub aficionado. You're not going to want to answer a call when you're in a dark nightclub or a loud concert. You're not going to hear it, for one. And then also, I'm an avid long-distance runner. I have gotten calls when I've been 18 miles away from my car. I'm going to be a little while before I get back to my car, so can you deal with this? While running, talking on an on-call critical incident. It happens, and for reference, I'm also running the marathon tomorrow, so please don't call me for on-call. Tomorrow, I'll be running. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Ticketmaster, the same slide that Mark showed. So we are one of the largest e-commerce sites. We're the largest ticket marketplace. We're based out of Hollywood, California, though I have interesting endeavors walking to work in the morning. I have the characters like Spidey Whitey and Dirty SpongeBob, and it's always a challenge to get to work, and by the time I get there, I'm all hyped up for the day because I've had adventure already. So we sell 500 million tickets per year. We're out of 30 different countries, and we have 80 million unique monthly visitors. It's a ton of visitors. But I'm going to give you a little bit of the history of Ticketmaster. We were founded in 1976 by a couple of guys at Arizona State University. 1977, we sold our first concert ticket to Electric Light Orchestra. I think it was in New Mexico. 1996, we founded Ticketmaster.com. I started in 1998, so I was there from the very beginning. I was helping spin up the Mexico site, was one of my first duties. 2010, we merged with Live Nation. And since then, we've been doing innovating, scaling, et cetera. We've got verified fan presence, ticket exchange, some of our newer technologies. Sorry, trying to find the least squealy space. So with the 1996, when we launched Ticketmaster.com, that was a Windows site. We were using a precursor to ASP, IDC HTX. It was basically the back end of ASP without all the fancy features. We used that for a really long time, to the point where we'd go up to Microsoft and they'd go, "You use what? Why are you using that?" We had, I'm going to say, 2 front-end servers, 2 event database investigative servers, and then 2 transactional servers at the back end of it. And this was 1 data center, a single database, and so on. We expanded that drastically. We expanded to a second database, second cluster, second data center, you name it. And it just grew and grew and grew. We used to be running on a HP Vectra, which was a desktop gaming machine. And then we expanded from there and started buying real server hardware. So we've got the we've been around for over 40 years selling tickets, but we've also been on the internet for over 20 years. You're going to end up with a whole bunch of tech debt. So as I mentioned, we're one of the largest ticketing marketplaces, or we are the largest ticketing marketplace. We've got big scale and big challenges. So we have on sales. Basically, every Friday is a self-inflicted DDoS. You have traffic spikes that shoot through the roof. The older days of this, I would tell the vendors, we're going to fall over during the on sale. No, 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 that's impossible. CNN does 10x traffic that you do. No, we're going to fall over during the on sale. Can you come in and watch? And they'd come in and they'd go, oh. They would get the understanding that that same amount of traffic that you can attribute to CNN, we were doing it in a minute. And that was a lot of the problem. You figure there's 70,000 fans that want to buy tickets to our most recent big on sale was BTS, big K-pop band. You figure those 70,000 fans are trying to buy 30,000 tickets. You're going to end up with 40,000 unhappy people. Refresh, 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 refresh. And as Mark stated, he's got the queue now, so that takes a little bit of the load off the systems. But we didn't always have that. That's a more modern development. He mentioned the 4 million bots. Those 4 million bots are also hammering away at the systems. He's doing his best to keep them off of our systems, but we still are feeling a little bit of fallout from that for the on-prem infrastructure. So this is a little bit of the Ticketmaster tech scale. We've got more than 20 ticketing systems, and I'll get into what ticketing systems are in a little bit here. A couple of you already know this one. 250 unique products, 1,400 people in the product and tech organization, 15,000 network endpoints across the world. That's venues, that's kiosks, that's arenas. We've got a public cloud. We've got, 20,000 VMs on the on-prem private cloud. And then we've also started using Kubernetes. So this picture over here, I call this the Museum of Arcane and Archaic Technology. I realize not everybody here knows what this is. This is a VAX. And a VAX is our base for our ticketing systems. We took VMS and rewrote it to a custom Ticketmaster interface, VAX TMOS, and wrote it so that it could do what Ticketmaster does best, and that's turn out unique inventory as fast as possible. So VAX, stealing this from Wikipedia, is a discontinued instruction set architecture from DEC. It's from the 70s, assembly language. It's known for managing virtual memory. So like I said, we've got our custom-written OS for the sake of selling ticketing inventory. And because I'm on the infrastructure team, I did not want to be the one hunting yard sales looking for leftover VAX parts to put everything back together. Back in the early 2000s, we virtualized the VAX onto Linux, and we've been keeping things steady there ever since. So on that note, one of my colleagues said, lately I've realized my job is part engineer, part docent. So he's officially a docent for the Museum of Archaic and Arcane Technology. What's a docent? The guy who takes you around the museum and tells you all about all the tour guide, exactly. So setting the stage, I've already said we've got high-profile activity out of scope of pretty much what everybody else does. People cry if they don't get their tickets. Sorry, you've ruined my daughter's life. She didn't get her BTS ticket. I hate you. You're horrible. Ticketmaster, you suck. All over Twitter, of course. Oh, wait, I'm moving around too much. So with that, we have to hurry to innovate. We have to hurry to keep up with the scale. We have to always be on, always be paying attention. So we've got 40 years of building and innovating. We've got 20 years of being on the internet. You grow to support these self-inflicted DDoSes. You scale horizontally. You've got 2 clusters that serve the traffic fine. Well, the traffic's gone up, so what do? You build 2 more clusters. Well, those 4 clusters serve it fine. What do? You build another 2 clusters in another data center to geographically load balance. You bolt things onto the side of other things. Well, you want this brand new feature. It doesn't fit in any of the existing code base. Well, what do? You tack it on the side, add another service to a box that does something completely different. You engineer a new thing to replace the old thing. So you build this great new thing. It's more efficient. It's more logically designed. It's architected instead of just organically grown over time. And then nobody likes it. So what you end up is 2 different systems running in parallel. Scoot over again. 2 different systems running in parallel, and then the teams restructure. And the people who were running the old thing are no longer running the old thing. The people want to run the shiny new thing. And you end up with a whole bunch of orphans with no support. What happens with orphans? This is some of the tragedy of our tech debt is we've restructured, we've built a new thing, people don't necessarily move to it, and you still need to keep this thing up and going at a production grade level of support. With production level usage, high traffic usage. So I have to, of course, include a Archer slide. I didn't include the phrasing one. I could have also come up with something that you would call out phrasing on, but I think we can do this is how you get tech debt. So what I'm going to do here is call out the art of deprecation, and some of the pitfalls that we've been fighting with in trying to get rid of some of these orphans and some of the older things that we run. So how do you determine ownership? Well, once upon a time, we didn't have a service catalog. I was the service catalog. And the only reason I was the service catalog is because I had been around since the dawn of time. Ticketmaster ate my youth. I might as well get something out of the mix. Reading down a list of 200 servers, going, I know what that is, I know what that is, I know what that is. Hey, that belongs to that person, I know what that is. I'm ashamed to admit that I was doing that as recently as 2 weeks ago. We do have a service catalog. We've gotten everything logged into our service catalog, but one of the things is that it's not necessarily static. And right now it is kind of static. As people restructure, people reorganize, people don't claim the ownership of the new product, get rid of the ownership of the old product, you end up with stale data. So how do you find the owner of something that's been orphaned? You have the right answer. So yeah, you research, you look at a Confluence page, you pull up the old archived wiki and you see if maybe somebody had talked about it in the past. You look at Jira tickets. Who built this years ago? You look up old emails. You ask the old timer. You look at the code comments. You run a netstat. What's connecting to this thing? Maybe the person who's connecting to this thing knows what it is. You look at the system logs, you look at the web logs, you look at everything. You finally get sign off that, yeah, that looks like it's an orphan. So what do? And as you said, you turn it off. This is a snippet of a real email. A couple of you actually saw this email, so they can attest to it. There are 70 remaining hosts that don't have an owner, or they're halted. They are taking up space on our hypervisors. What are they? We're going to get rid of them. We're going to halt them. We're going to destroy them. I'm giving you a couple weeks. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Well, so sometimes we break things. We shut down these boxes of unknown ownership. 3 days later, there's a critical incident. People are going, we didn't change anything. Our system's fine. We haven't even done a release in months. Why did we break? Well, we look over, and there's, in a health check, a mention of a service that's a dependency, and it says it's degraded. Well, that degraded service degraded the whole service above it. And once upon a time, when we were doing our more Java service-oriented architecture, we built into our health checks a dependency chain that said if this service is degraded, the whole service is degraded, and if it degrades too much, it's going to drop it out of rotation. It's great in concept, but unless you keep things up to date, it's going to eventually break things. The health check was looking to make sure it still lived there. So as I said here, we did the research. We did everything we could to try to find it. But there was no accounting for this legacy knowledge, this tribal knowledge that wasn't necessarily shared across the people who still existed at the company, aside from some random confusing thing in the back of my head. So what do you do when a one-off hack becomes a product dependency? We've had many applications over the years. As I mentioned, things fall out of favor, and we start working to deprecate it. We build a new one. So we had this client portal. It was the front end for our old reporting tool. It was okay. It was on older technology. We were trying to get rid of it. It did its job decent. It had unique logins. It had password expiration. It had the ability to segment the data by clients, so you could only see that specific client's information. And it could be managed hierarchically by the support team. So, okay, it was fine, but it needed to go. It had already been determined that it was going to be end of life. So what do? Well, we need an identity solution ASAP. We need this yesterday. We don't have time to build one. Let's tack this thing on the side of it. Let's force this Lego into a mega block and get out the hammer, pound it, make it fit. And then what do you have? You have an end-of-life system that now has this new modern system bolted onto the side of it. What you do is you end up wrecking their roadmap because you need to get rid of this old system. This old system is going to be out of security compliance very soon unless you get rid of it. There was already a deprecation plan, but you just ruined that for everybody. So just because you can bolt something onto the side of something You need to think about the repercussions of what it is that you're trying to do at that time. So this is a quote I stole off of Twitter. 3 stages of memory loss for a system. When can we remove this hack? Does anybody know why we do this? Nobody knows why we do this, so I'm afraid to touch it. That's the story of my life. Story of my life. I thought it was very appropriate. So dependency mapping failures. You want to implement shared services because you don't want to reinvent the wheel every time somebody is trying to solve a problem. You want to be able to use a shared API. You want to be able to use the same data. You want to be able to have access to the same customer information. But shared services are only as good as their subscriber lists. If you don't know who is using this shared service, which we do end up in that situation a lot of the time, if you don't know who's using it, you can't do maintenance. You can't plan for decommission it. You can't upgrade it without knowing what you're going to disrupt. We've used various shared services for our various sales channels, our mobile, our desktop, our IVR. And some of those things didn't necessarily tell us that they were using these services. So once we needed to upgrade them, we had to find all the customers that were using these things. And like I said, if there's not a registry of users that are using it, then you don't know who you're going to affect. How do you know when it's actually time to retire it? Do you know if all the users are off of it? You can ask, and you know you're not going to necessarily get a good answer. So retirement of this process gets delayed. Upgrades get delayed. Security updates get delayed because no one owns it. No one manages it. No one persists it in its modern state. And then here's the other one, ownership until death. I feel like I'm not the Dark Queen of ticketing anymore. I'm the Grim Reaper of ticketing. You need someone to actually own a system until death. Deprecation is part of the software lifecycle. Retirement is part of the software lifecycle. Everybody always ignores that because we made it pretty, it was great, it did its job, let's walk away. You can't walk away from things. So you establish an end of support date. That gets ignored, gets begged, people borrow time. People say, oh, well, we need just 1 more week, just 1 more week. Well, you got the end of support date, we're not supporting it anymore. So do what you will. Well, you also need to set a retirement date. The retirement date needs to be set so that this day we're turning things off. That date is also going to slip. We were just talking about this, a couple of my colleagues and I, that yes, we know it's going to slip, but it's still better that it's been communicated that this thing is actively going to be shut down at some point. If you have a product that you're moving to a different team, you need to have a team that's accountable for it. You can't tag it to just one guy because that one guy is going to leave the company and not warn anybody. And you need to actually get a definition of when this thing has been successfully decommissioned. So the next section, the high cost of end of life. It's more than just a couple of extra servers. So the long tail of retirement. There will always be somebody who's unhappy with the replacement. That last 10%. You set an end of support date. You know that it's going to be shut down eventually, and you make it slightly more inhospitable. If we're not supporting it, it's not friendly, you're not going to get new features. If you want the new features, you need to move over to the new thing that we are very actively supported, and we have a full, thank you, Dave. We actually have a full team of people supporting and adding new features because this is the currently supported product. So it may slip and all, but you're still working on getting people to move to the new thing. The last 10%, at some point you need to rip off the Band-Aid because this last 10%, you've got 10% of people using something that is a really poor showing for how great your company is and what good products they can give and what good support they can give. You have this janky thing that's run by 2 people and they're not getting quick action on it. Well, that's not our support level. That's not what we're trying to relay to the public. And then we have things that we'll say we keep old things because they're beloved and they're stable. That's not a permanent reason to keep things. So tribal knowledge and attrition. You didn't build this beloved, stable platform. Neither did your coworker. In fact, you look at the code comments and you don't recognize that guy from the gal. He's not in the gal. You don't recognize anybody who's ever commented on this thing. Oh, look, the documentation was last updated in 1996. Okay, that's going a little far, but there are things that I find documentation 2014. In internet time, that's a long time. What's GAL? Global Address List. The Outlook mail address book. So find documentation that was last updated by Mark. So as I mentioned, the feature requests just kind of get bolted onto the side because you've got this beloved stable platform. Nobody wants to touch it, but OK, we need this new feature, so we're just going to add another service running on the same box. Well, you've still got the developers on board. You can get a proper handoff. You can go chase down somebody and say, hey, Mark, how does this work? You can go ask a team before that team's disbanded, how does this work? You can get this information traded off to somebody. But if you have just full-on attrition, people leaving the company without actual warning, without actually handing off a product, you end up with a lot of unknowns. So there's other aspects, not just the software support, but the hardware support. Vendors are really good about telling us when their hardware's end of life, and unlike the software side, they don't have those fuzzy deadlines that we do. They say, we are no longer supporting this thing after January 2000. Well, people say, oh, we don't have time to move to that. It doesn't fit in our roadmap. OK, well, it works fine, maybe, for now. We don't have a support contract. It falls over. It's going to be catastrophic, and the vendor is going to go, ha ha. And you need to keep up with the rolling retirement of hardware behind you. So you spend time moving end-of-life hardware assets off because you don't want to end up in a situation where you have a catastrophic failure with no support contract. We've done one fairly recently. We had storage shelves that were going end of life in very short order. We had a segment of our root disks running on these storage shelves that were going end of life really quick. So what we had to do was, hey, these storage shelves are going end of life. You have two options. You can either migrate, reprovision these boxes yourself, which will put them on the new storage, or you can wait for us to do it for you, and that'll probably be at 2 o'clock in the morning when you really don't want to be involved in supporting it. So there's two ways to do that, and one of them is ask nicely and have them do it, or the second way of forcing them to do it, because at the end of the day, we need to get this old decrepit hardware out of there and move on. And then compliance. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, much like Mark. Bad people also watch presentations, so I'm not going to give you the specific details of things. But one of the things you need to keep up with, particularly when you're processing credit cards and so on, is making sure you're on compliant systems. There's no glory in bug fixes. Nobody wants to spend the time in upgrading an OS or upgrading OpenSSL or anything else that might be required to keep their system modern and compliant. We have our yearly PCI audits, and it's a matter of chasing people until they get things done. And people put it very low on their roadmap. They need to actually schedule it into their planned roadmap so that you can get the proper attention onto it. Sometimes newer versions of components won't run on older versions of OSs. It's a forcing function there. You have to upgrade to be able to support this newer thing. We're not going to build you some really sketchy JDK that runs on your older OS because that's not something that we want to support for the long term. We have things like that we support for the long term, and it's not a way to keep moving and modernizing in the future. The added issue with this is you have configuration management. You have to write in the exceptions. So on this version, you can't do this. On this version, you can't do this. You can't do this on here, and you can't do this on here. What you end up with is overly complicated configuration management, and complex systems are riskier systems because you can't just look at it and say, this is the expected result when you do X, Y, and Z. You need to extrapolate what's going to happen when you add A, B, and C, and G, F, and H on top of it. So modernization, how to get people to realize that it's important, and not just because we don't want to build their janky packages. So one of the things you need to do is classify your products. So we've recently started calling out things. The classification, you can put them in 3 different buckets. So we've got 3 here. And I talk ad nauseum about deprecate because, like I said, I'm the Grim Reaper of Ticketmaster. Encapsulate is more a modernizing those beloved legacy products in such a way that they're maintainable for an extended period of time. You still need to work on setting a retirement date for them, but we're not going to kill them off right away. And then we've got this last one, grow. I don't talk about that because everybody wants to grow everything. All the new information you got out here in the other talks, you're like, ooh, I'm going to run with that. I'm going to create this new shiny thing, and this is going to be great. And everybody wants to grow their new products and grow things from there. So tech maturity. We went from a legacy kind of siloed organization where we had systems engineers, we had operations, we had DBs, we had a dev team, we had a QA team. We had all of these things, and they're all separate, and they all did handoffs between tasks, between tasks, between tasks. So QA would hand off to the operations team to deploy, and so on. And you never really saw things end to end. The operations teams would watch the on-fills. They would sit there and observe the traffic, observe things spiking through the roof, observe things falling over when things spike through the roof. And then they'd go relay that back to the dev teams, and the dev teams would try to build something that they would think would fit with it, and that didn't work. When about 2015 or so, we switched over to the DevOps model. We gave the developers access to the systems. They started deploying their own code. They could monitor, they could watch what happened. They would get woken up in the middle of the night if they had a release that went poorly. They were the ones who got woken up instead of the operations team getting woken up, calling the dev team, and going from there. You had a lot of churn, you had a lot of time, mean time to resolve was huge. So we created an environment where the product could watch, or where the product team could watch a product from end to end and see how things were going. So we got some good, some bad, and some growth out of this whole thing. You had now the ability to do fast releases, CI/CD. You could turn things around quickly, and you could do incremental releases instead of a 2-week development cycle where you had to wait and hope for the best when you did that release. So it greatly reduced our recovery time because the eyes that were on it were the eyes that wrote it. And it also gave better feedback up to the business because the person who wrote it and who knew what the problem was could tell the business exactly what happened instead of playing a game of telephone through an operations team, through a systems engineering team, and working their way up. Another notion of tech maturity here. Back in those days, we wrote a tech maturity model. It's basically the bare minimum that you need to move to the public cloud. And at that point, we were doing a really hard and fast drive to move everything to the public cloud. Hey, we're going to close our data centers one day, and it's all going to go to AWS. And like many companies have learned, that's not fiscally responsible. We wrote this tech maturity model so that we could look at how an application fit into the whole scheme of things. Is this thing resilient? Is this thing redundant? Does this thing react well to something falling over? Just a single node falling over? Do you have to go rebuild an entire cache because a single system fell over and needed to be restarted? Well, that sort of thing is not conducive to moving to public cloud. Public cloud instances are not nearly as stable as on-prem VM instances because there is no requirement that those things be 100% on. Exactly, exactly. So I call out no forklift. You need to have cloud readiness. You can't just take a legacy application that is sprawl everywhere. It was built for sprawl. It was built to tack on another cluster every time you needed to expand capacity. And those legacy applications, if they didn't think about how they were writing it and the fact that things wouldn't be always on, or that things needed to scale up and you needed some lead time to be able to scale them up, they're not necessarily suited for that environment. You also needed, because we no longer were allowing interactive login to EC2 instances, to Kubernetes. All of those things, you needed to build in the instrumentation to your code that allowed you the visibility to be able to assure that your system was operating properly. So you needed valid alerting, logging, and you needed debugging. You needed to be able to go, okay, well, let me deploy this little batch of code for debug, and let me get the feedback and see why it's not quite working right. You couldn't just SSH into a box and take a look at the logs and see what was going on. So this held very true for AWS and still holds true for Kubernetes. We have both, and both of these things, unless you have some aspect of maturity, you're not going to succeed there.
So you're managing your own Kubernetes clusters for your on-prem resources and you're using AWS for everything else?
No. We have Kubernetes on-prem. We have Kubernetes in AWS.
Through EKS, or you manage it there?
We manage it there too. And AWS, we don't allow just bare EC2 instances anymore. It needs to be something that's able to be containerized and made more use of what resources that are there. So this is a little snippet of the tech maturity model. We open sourced this. If you saw on my slide, there was a link to our GitHub and so on. We're not as actively using this as we were originally when we first launched it, but it is still very useful information for the sake of, hey, is my application mature enough to be able to move into a public cloud or move into Kubernetes and move away from a VM to application kind of model. So another aspect of tech maturity, no hand-built boxes. You can't sit there and configure a specific node to do a specific thing manually. You need to use a reproducible deployment method. Ideally, you'd be able to codify the infrastructure as well. You need to be able to tear it down, run a script to rebuild it, some infrastructure as code, and be able to get that going. You need to be able to think about things in terms of Chaos Monkey. Like I mentioned, EC2, Kubernetes, those are made for flexibility and speed, not for permanent resiliency. If you do a regular rebuild of your non-prod environments using your codified deploy mechanisms and your infrastructure as a service, you can verify that even the most junior member on your team can rebuild the environment at the drop of a hat. You don't want to have to call that guy who's been with the company for 10 years to rebuild this special unicorn of a box, and when the systems team wants to do a maintenance on it, you don't want to have that guy show up because he's the only one who knows how that thing works. So as I mentioned, you need to establish a retirement date for your old products. So you stand up the new product, you need to have the retirement date already established for the old product. You need to figure out, if we're introducing this new thing and we've got it full featured at this point, you need to plan when that old product is going to go away. We don't just need a date. We need a plan. We need to know all of the consumers of your application. We need to know how they've been communicated to. We need to know the timeline of your plan. We need to know how you're going to clean up at the end of it all. Can you do a partial decom? So if you're collapsing your hypervisor footprint and you're making a change, can we collapse it down to 2 hypervisors from 50? Can we move everything over there? Is that enough resilience for keeping things going until you manage to get everything moved over so you can deprecate? So what needs to be cleaned up? As I mentioned, tons of orphans, the helper applications, things like this box that only exists for the sake of keeping this health check happy. You need to get rid of those. You need to get rid of monitoring. We use some third-party services for monitoring. You got Datadog, AppDynamics, Rigor, things like that. If you get rid of your product and don't clean that up, all you're doing is throwing money, throwing it. You need to clean up storage. We have so much storage in use because nobody bothered to clean up the Q trees after they decommissioned a VM. So you need to be able to call out that you've done that as well. And I see my coworker twitching over there. You need to clean up DNS. You end up with scads of DNS entries, and you go to look things up, and when you're trying to find the owner of an orphan, you go, oh, well, there's a DNS entry for it. Well, that just got left behind. CDN. we had Akamai and Fastly properties. If you don't clean up the old Akamai property that you used to use and you haven't touched in 10 years, you're just, like I said, throwing money. VMs, yes, you might have idle VMs if you don't get rid of them. They're not using interesting resources, but they're still making it so you can't move things there. And this accounts for all environments, so pods, EC2 instances, et cetera, as well. You want to make sure that you get rid of those when it's time to get rid of those. That needs to be part of your cleanup plan. That needs to not be me asking, can I shut this down? Because nobody says they own it. And you need to clean up the service catalog. As I mentioned, we're defining all of these items in the service catalog, but the service catalog gets stale. So you need to make sure that you get rid of things that you are no longer actively running. At the very least, because people like to reuse names. And if you leave the old name and somebody builds a new one, we've had this happen a number of times. That's not that product from 1996, that's that product from 2002. No, not the product from 2008. So you need to make sure that you clean up after yourself, all across the board. And then you need a definition of done. Yes, we've successfully deprecated this product. So incentives for modernizing. As I mentioned, you want to drive people to modernize, not just clean up the cruft. End-of-life hardware is one area that gets hung up on the tech debt. What if I told you you could move your product to a brand new, highly performant flash array if you just made a couple of changes, cleaned up your software a little bit? That would be great. What if I told you you could move to a brand new, more robust network, new network gear, everything? What if I told you you could move to a less populated tenant because not everybody has cleaned up their stuff? That means you're going to murder this thing for a long time until everybody else starts moving in. Newer logging solution is available to you if you move over here. You could move to public cloud, as I mentioned. If you have your software maturity, you could move to public cloud. Or you could move to Kubernetes if you've matured in such a way that that is now an option for you. So we've also got non-modernization forcing. And that I should have realized was going to be a stumbling word. So sometimes you can't offer the new and shiny. Sometimes you need to put your foot down. And sometimes you need to do this to make a secure and stable infrastructure for your users. Sometimes you need to tell and not ask. Sometimes you need to ask for forgiveness and not permission. My example of the shutdown on this day, that's an example of telling and not asking. So we will be shutting down everything without a defined owner. That's one way of doing it. We will be changing access control so that any people attached to a product have access, but everybody else doesn't. So if you don't have your service catalog updated to identify that you own this product, you're no longer going to be able to access it. And any of these things that are end of life, we can say, well, you can't access it, so you needed to tell us. You needed to keep things modern. Another example, we will be turning off an insecure cipher on this date. You need to check your code. It is your responsibility. This is DevOps. You are responsible for making sure that everything we need to do to keep compliant is done. And we can't say, hey, you need to do this, because it just will never happen. And then we will be doing a DR of our critical systems on this date. Because we're DevOps, you own your product. You need to be the one responsible for making sure it comes up, making sure everything is functional after this DR. So we round you all up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And we have 40 teams sitting there. And this is for a DR for our filer in the first place. So we've got 40 teams sitting there. The 40 teams are going through and validating their code. And we said, you don't have to show up. If you have good enough instrumentation in your code and you get proper alerting to you so that you know that your product did not come back up correctly, you don't have to join us. You can wait until you get your on-call. I can say all except one team joined us. So that's one of those things like, OK, if you have instrumented your code properly, you're not going to get woken up unless something goes wrong. Otherwise, you're sitting with us and doing it with us. And then quantifying the cost of end of life. You look at how much time and energy you're spending on keeping things on life support. So everything can also suffer from culture debt and communication debt. You have the teams all of this time, all of this churn, all of this back and forth to try to find out who owns this, who's responsible for it, who is going to deal with this thing. Too many teams do the out of sight, out of mind concept. And everybody plays a game of hot potato that causes a lot of strife and a lot of inattention because there is actually no answer. You waste time that you could be spending doing something useful. As I mentioned for the roadmaps, we put a bowling ball through your roadmap. You're going to do it at some point. So you end up wasting things. It's not just with the physical assets, the licensing, the public cloud. There's all of the wasted money on thinking that your capacity is a certain level, and it's not because people haven't bothered to clean up. So another aspect of the cost of end of life, you have the culture and communication debt, as I mentioned, the blame game. Oh, no, they left it up. That's not ours. If it falls over, that's on them. Hot potato, passing it over, back and forth, back and forth. I think my job at this point is more talking to people and finding out what things are than it is actually doing something useful and modernizing. You end up with dissatisfaction. You end up with all these people that are stuck on managing these old products because they are the one guy that still knows how to do it while the rest of their colleagues are working on the new, shiny, modern thing. So I've told you some horror stories, and I've told you some ways we've tried to work past them. I've told you some of the pitfalls on using some of these mechanisms to try to get things moved. And I've told you some ideas on how you can force a state of deprecation on your product stack, as well as ideas on how to motivate people to clean things up for this encapsulation phase where you're going to keep something that's old and beloved and legacy until such time as a proper replacement and a proper item that can be grown to the future is established. So you can tell I feel pretty strongly about the retirement phase. Grim Reaper, my goal, though, is moving people towards modernization. I don't want to have teams stuck dragging the corpses of their old products behind them. I want them to be able to go work on the new thing. I don't want them to have to keep the old thing living indefinitely. Developers like to tinker. Systems people like to tinker. They don't like to just keep poking at the dead thing behind them. So we've got 40 years of tech debt dragging behind us. Let's release the old, shine up those new beloved items, and get people moving on to the new things. So I thought this was appropriate. We totally have professional grade numbers here. We don't have those rookie numbers. And this is my reason for Dark Queen of Ticketing to have white cat fur on herself. But any questions? Yes?
How direct a consequence do you think saying that abandonment and support vendor products is a result of having a centralized ops team? People who write the thing do not want
So as I mentioned, we went from having the ops team and then having DevOps. And the ops team, once upon a time, knew the big picture, knew how everything interacted with each other, and knew that this thing did X, Y, and Z, and this thing did this. And if this wasn't working right, you went to this dev team. When you move to DevOps, you no longer have those guardrails that tell you how everything fits together. And I think that lends itself to creating a little more orphans. I think, to some extent, it's a shortcoming of the DevOps model, because if you don't have the proper service catalog and the proper guardrails to prevent people from doing things like that, then you end up in that situation. Yes?
Are your slides going to be online?
Yes.
Okay.
I haven't yet. They asked us for our slides. I haven't provided them yet, but I will get them released.
Like just find them on the website after?
Yeah, I will get through the Scale site, wherever they say that we should put them. Mm-hmm. Any more questions? Any smart-ass remarks from my colleagues? How about a dumbass question from your colleague? Thanks, Mark. Yes? So Ticketmaster Vax, we do a global distribution, like for example, tickets in California are on a specific system and they're not necessarily shared across them. So it is very targeted per time zone, very targeted per market because it's unique inventory. You can't spin up additional ones and you can't sell the same inventory twice. You need to have unique, which then makes it have to be regional. Otherwise, it's not going to work.